the user doesn't see the server or the client. The user doesn't care about this. Maybe we should center the way we express our user interfaces from the user's perspective more than from technology separation perspective.
Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Paige Niederinghaus, and today we have Dan Abramoff, React Core team member, here to talk about JSX over the wire. In this episode, Dan and I talk about a new paradigm shift for passing server data to the client, what the term backend for frontend means, and advice for teams looking to start using React server components in their own applications. So here's our episode with Dan Abramoff. Hello, everyone. I am your host today, Paige Niederinghaus, and we are joined by Dan Abramoff, a React Core team member, here to talk about JSX over the wire. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
We are very glad to have you on the podcast. You have started writing on your blog over Reacted Again, which I'm sure a lot of people are very excited about, myself included. So let's talk about your blog post, which is entitled JSX Over the Wire. Can you tell us a little bit about the concepts that you talk about, the general idea of it for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet?
I've been really on a writing streak, and I guess a part of it is I left my job at Blue Sky a couple of months ago, so I've not been really doing anything, and I realized that I had some unfinished business with talking about React Server components. So really, these posts are about React Server components. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that a lot of people don't like React or think that they don't like React Server components. And I think there's quite a bit of misconception about what those things are. So in this post, I think it's partially fictionalized, so it's not exactly how it happened, but it retraces some parts of the kind of historical lineage that led to this concept. If you were dealing with problems of web applications on your own today, maybe you could have discovered it on your own. And so this post shows two different ways you could arrive at the same idea, and it ties those ways together by the end.
So you just touched on a big part of it, which was how do you pass state from server to client and what's the best way to render things? So looking back on it, why do you think that the industry has struggled for so long to find a natural way to pass both data and behavior between the server and the client?
Yeah, I think it's still an unsolved problem, right? I think part of the post is that, I think there is a solution that has very interesting characteristics that is not yet acknowledged in kind of the mainstream area. I don't think it's being recognized for what it deserves to be recognized. So I think there is a step forward being proposed there. But I think the reason it's been difficult is partially just how you approach it really depends on which side you're coming from. And part of it is historical, right? In the beginning, there was really no notion of the client side because the client side was severely underpowered. And so we started on the server, we started with CGI or later PHP or Ruby or all these kind of server-centric frameworks. And that was a certain strain of evolution where we learned maybe to make templates, or MVC became popular. And there was this whole thing, how do you do server rendered applications? And I think there were some really good ideas and good techniques there. But then later client got more powerful, and we started approaching it from purely clients. Initially mixed perspective, but it was hard to mix them because these are separate technologies. All of the techniques we use in programming, like lexical scoping or modules, or how do you pass data, or how do you even represent data? What kind of objects can you pass around, and so on. All of that is different between the client and the server. And so naturally, we started thinking, if we start with the client, how much can they gain from this being our frame of reference? And I think that approach culminated with client-side routing, React, the way people were using React in 2016, 2017, especially purely client-side. But it also has its own drawbacks where some things have gotten really complicated. The way you fetch data is complicated. It has some inefficiencies that are just inherent to the idea that you're looking from the client-centric perspective, but actually the data lives on the server, and you always have to cross that bridge to get more of it. And so I think there were some kind of flaws in that perspective as well. But because they're separated by technologies, they're often separated by teams. So sometimes you have these organizational boundaries where there's the backend team and there's the front end team. And so it becomes different camps with different rituals, different techniques we use. And I think there wasn't enough of, let's just see this from the user's perspective, right? The user doesn't see the server of the client. That's not a concept. The user sees a blog post or an avatar or a comment section, a filterable table. So what if we try to look at the whole thing from the user's perspective and divide it by technology kind of later as different kind of layers of those things that we create on the screen? And so this is the approach taken by React Server Components. But of course, it annoys the backend camp because the client plays a really big role there, and it annoys the client camp because the backend plays a really big role there. So it's really about the user doesn't care about this, and maybe we should center the way we express our user interfaces from the user's perspective more than from technology separation perspective.
Yeah, but you proposed something good. You say that the backend team doesn't necessarily want the client side to dictate how they write their API, and the client doesn't want the backend team to write it the way that they want, which is more of a pure way of passing data back and forth. You talked about this backend as front end. So is this an architecture that is more, in your opinion, back to the future, or is it a genuinely new approach to doing data between clients and servers?
The end state that I get to with React Server Components, I think the vibe is more like old school server rendering, where not in the React server rendering, like literally like PHP and XHP, which was an evolution of PHP at Facebook, but with components, right? Facebook had something like JSX, but in PHP, and that was a precursor to React actually. And I think like there is this very natural way to say my UI consists of these pieces, and these pieces run on the backend. They have full access to backend resources. And that is a little bit before this introduction of the idea of an API. An API is something more generic that like many clients can call, whereas this is more kind of hypermedia focused approach where you say, like, the only thing I want to return is this UI. So this is an API that is specifically exists for this reason. And so in this sense, I think it's more similar to old school and a server approach where you just return an HTML almost, but you can create your own abstractions. But in terms of how it works, I think it's closer to the API JSON, like we're transferring JSON. We're not really sending HTML. Of course, we can convert JSON to HTML for like first render, but really we can pass rich objects. It's kind of like, what if HTML could express rich applications, not just the first render, but throughout the application's lifetime? So you can pass JSON to components that can run on the client, like a richer version of HTML almost. And so it has this kind of API-ish or rich vibes as well. And then of course we're not underestimating the client, right? Like the client is not an afterthought. The client is where all the rich, stateful, interactive logic lives. And so that is influenced by the client-side approaches. So that is also very much a part of the picture. So in that sense, like it takes things from each of those like strands of evolution, but brings them together in a slightly different way than a lot of other solutions. But speaking, you mentioned BFF, like there's this pattern that's gaining some popularity over the last few years, I think, called backend for frontend, that also, and I use it throughout the text quite a bit because that is a part of how React Server Components was discovered, is by thinking along those lines. But this pattern is more general, right? It's not specific to React. It's just this idea that it makes sense that the API team or like the backend team might want to separate some of their data logic into these REST API endpoints, or like something that's not UI specific, that can serve many clients, that doesn't change every time you change the UIs, some kind of interface. But that interface is just, if you really want to, like the backend team to be happy, the interface that they would want to provide is not really the interface that is needed by the front end part, because the front end part wants to collate some of these API endpoints, right? Like we want to expand some fields. We don't care about some other fields for some other screens. We want to sometimes do some extra computation with those fields, preparing them. And this is also a familiar pattern. It's sometimes called the view model. So it's this idea that it's not the raw model the way we store it in the database. It's really cooked. It's prepared for a specific piece of UI. And so this idea of backend for frontend is, what if frontend had a representative piece of code on the backend? What if frontend was actually not just on the front, but it also had a backend part that prepared raw backend data for consumption by a specific part of the front end? And so this is the idea of a BFF, is just what if there was a layer that did that? And then server components are like, what if that layer was structured as components, which is beneficial if you want to compose those bits and reuse them.
That's a wonderful kind of explanation of it. So one of the things that you talked about in an earlier iteration before React Server Components and BFF really came along was XHP, which was Facebook's version of PHP. Why do you think that the broader web community didn't really move towards ideas like XHP and async XHP earlier?
Yeah, so just to give a quick idea of what XHP is, you can imagine it as like in traditional old school PHP. You would just like echo parts of HTML and then use string interpolation to create functions like, oh, this is my like table header, and it goes into database or whatever. And some of that was like insecure in many cases and not really composable, hard to scale. And I think as the first generation of web developers learned the pitfalls of this approach and like how it is lacking some order, there was a move towards more structured approaches. And usually what you would do is you would extract templates. So you would write these like template files that don't contain any logic. They're just HTML with holes where you insert data. And then you have some other layer like a controller or a view model or like something that actually gets that data. And I think this became popular just because it does solve the problems of the previous approach. And it's the maybe more like obvious step is let's try to apply the MVC paradigm to it. It's funny that the same thing happened on front end, right? Before React, the way you would do front end is you would usually have something like MVC, like you would use Backbone, but you would also have this, here is my template. It's written in like mustache instead of Jinja or whatever, but it's the same idea transplanted. And then I think React killed MVC on the front end. And there is a seminal talk called Rethinking Best Practices by Pete Hunt that really put React on the map, I think, after it was ridiculed for a couple of years. And it made the case that actually this view model logic, this thing that adapts the data to the presentation, it's inseparable from the template. It is inherently coupled to the template because that is what it's for. Like the purpose of the view model is to adapt data in a way that can be presented by the template. So what if we merge those concepts into the concept of a component? And then the way we did separation of concerns is not by technology, like template versus controller, but instead vertically by here's the button, here's the form, here's the avatar or the comment, and so on. And that was our block, like UI itself was the unit of separation. And so I think for a lot of people, like in JavaScript world, it kind of took a while to get used to. But for Facebook, when React came out, nobody at Facebook was expecting that it would be received so poorly initially, because they were already bought into the idea of components from using XHP. Because XHP applied the same idea that the problem with messing with markup in code, it's not that you need to separate markup into some different world of templates, is that you need to make markup a first-class citizen. And the way you make it a first-class citizen is that instead of manipulating it as a string, which can destroy the structure of markup, right? Like you can mess up the closing tag, you can insert interpolated content that breaks the markup and so on. What if you treat it as an object, as a piece of syntax that gets statically validated, compile time checked, and interpolations are safe? And from this idea, it's very easy to arrive at the idea of components where, okay, how do you encapsulate pieces of UI? You just write a function that returns markup, and then you can compose these functions and refer to them. If you go by this route, which web development at large did not, because I don't think there was like any popular kind of open source solutions that used this kind of technique, because there was like Cold Fusion or ASP.NET Web Forms, but they had other significant issues that kind of made this model not very appealing in terms of how it is treated state and kind of interactivity. But the work has just diverged, and the backend kind of web development community has largely settled on MVC. And then MVC became popular on the client. And then I think arguably React has killed MVC on the client and turned it into components, or maybe reframed MVC, right? Like you could say C and some of these components and M are just their props. And I think React Server Components tries to do the same on the backend, because that's what happened at Facebook, is MVC was killed on the backend by XHP.
That's a great understanding and kind of example of it. You definitely see it when you look at the new web frameworks that are coming out today that have followed in React's footsteps. All the meta frameworks that have spawned off of it, Svelte, Vue, things like that, they're all doing the same vertical separation of concerns instead of the more horizontal older school. So that's a great understanding and explanation. So one other thing that you mentioned was that when you're working with traditional REST endpoints, there is a thing that happens just over time where either they become overpowered or they become underpowered, depending on what the UI needs. So can you talk a little bit more about how that happens, or why that seems to always happen as requirements evolve on the front end?
Yeah. So the way I kind of like to frame it is data doesn't have any particular shape. You decide what is it for. There's this sequence of transformations that have to happen between the way things are most efficient to store or retain all the information that we want to store, and then the things that we want to present to the user, right? And the example I'm using in the article is the like button. So in the database, maybe you have like a posts table with different posts. You have a likes table where each like is a separate row. It has the user who like submitted this like. It has the post ID, and maybe that's all it has, because a like is a very simple thing. But even with the simplest example that you can think of, actually, if you want to present it to the user, let's say you have this button that says liked by you and 12 others. Like, you already, to prepare this, you need to make some queries. Like, you need to check, is it liked by the current user? Does there exist a like in the table for the current user? Do there exist likes of the user's friends? Because you want to prioritize them, and if you have some friends who liked it, you want to put them first in this message, like by you and like your friend and not some random person. But if not, maybe you're okay with putting like a random person there, and then you want the count as well, so you want how many people did that. And so this information is personalized, it's aggregated, and there's a question, like, if you're making a REST endpoint for a post, you don't include all the likes there, right? Because if there's 1,000, you don't want 1,000. And there are questions like, do you embed the information about the likes into that post? Is it just a field like count 12? But then how do you know the friends' names? Is there liked by friend names? Or is it a separate API endpoint that returns a list of likes by friends? And so on. You have to make these decisions. If it's a separate API endpoint, does it contain friends' names? And then what if later you want to show their avatars next to the like button? Do you now include it in that endpoint? So there is this tension between the way the data is stored, which I call the model, and the way the data we want it to present, which I call the view model. And the problem with REST, and I don't mean REST in some theoretical sense that people sometimes like to nitpick, oh, we're not using REST as originally intended. The way I'm describing it by the end is actually closer with this REST is hypermedia. So I'm aware that I'm not describing it initially as it's originally intended. But even if you look at the way people actually use it, I think there's, depending on who has the most say in the company, you see REST endpoints either kind of gravitating towards the models. So they represent data closer to like its actual shape in the database, or something that's derived objectively from it. But that means that when they go to them and say, oh, like, I need these avatars, or I need this thing sorted by friends should come first, it kind of messes with the data model. It's okay, like, this piece of UI needs this, but maybe another piece of UI wants something different. So like, how do you reconcile it? And so in many cases, the backend gives you the thing, and then the front end, you sometimes have to make multiple requests to combine what you actually want, or you do some processing, or you just give up on the feature. You're like, oh, the API doesn't give me this. I guess no avatars are going to be shown. Then that is one extreme, when the backend runs the show. And then if the front-end team runs the show, you can see it going in the other direction where, okay, the API really needs this. We're going to add these conventions for expanding arbitrary properties in our REST endpoints. And we're going to have this like screen-specific fields, maybe just like, okay, post might have a field with liked by friends or whatever that is really UI specific. But then you have a UI redesign, and the things that these things need also change, but they're already locked into, like, you're not going to add like my friends v2, or there's some tension between, you probably don't have a good setup for deprecating fields or kind of swapping them out, or even different screens might need different information. And so some of them will suffer because the responses are geared towards, they're supposed to be these abstract entities like a post, right? That you go get /API/post/123. And you're not really saying, no, I want the representation of post as needed by this specific screen. And so I think that is the layer that we're missing, is something that would do this translation. And it is actually tightly coupled to the UI because the view model is the template. The view model cannot be separated from the template. And so we extended the same argument that Pete Hunt made in his talk across the backend. It's like the part that prepares the view model is also conceptually related to the component. It's not separate.
That's really how the backend for front end helps to bridge that gap between the REST APIs and whatever data they're giving back and the component driven architecture.
Yeah, so I think the backend for front end is like a possible first step towards bridging that divide. It is the least prescriptive kind of step I can think of that is still useful. And it's interestingly, it doesn't even have to be in JS, right? This pattern itself is more general. Funny enough, when I was working with Flask and Python in 2013, and we had this problem, right? Like we had a REST API that sometimes we needed like different things, a different level of granularity. It was not super great that the client had to ask, the client was a SPA, so the client kind of had to ask for them. And it was like after the page loaded, you go to the server, you load the page, it loads, the JavaScript starts running, and then JavaScript is like, oh, I'm gonna need these like 3 different things for a screen. So one of the first optimizations I actually made was on the Python side, I had a separate piece of logic that understood our routing, and it basically said which API calls should be pre-bundled into the HTML, so that at least when we send the HTML, we want to send some JSON that we know the client is going to request, just to avoid this silly kind of round trip and network waterfall. Just like at least have that first response already be there. And you can think of that as a proto BFF, right? It didn't have this, okay, get me all the data from the next screen kind of endpoint, but it was a piece of logic that says when the user visits a post page, just prepare the post response, post detailed response, post likes response, whatever, bundle them together. And so I think this is the first step. A BFF is just, in my conception, the way I imagine it, is just a part of your API server. It could be a separate server, it could be a part of your API server that is structured with the same routing structure as your application. So if you have /post/whatever, the user-facing API that they type in the address bar, replicate the same structure on the backend, and just include all the JSON that the screen is going to need. And then what this lets you do is on the client, you gain the ability to, instead of calling these REST API endpoints, you can just say, I'm on this screen. When the screen is loading, grab all the data needed for it, and then I'm going to plumb it down. If you think about frameworks like Remix, they implement the same exact pattern, right? Like they have this loader function that prepares data for a screen, but you can think of that as a piece of a BFF. It's just co-located with your components, right? And that's the next stage of BFF, is like starting to blend it and bring it closer so that you can have like type checking and so on. But really the first step you could make is just an API endpoint that returns all the data needed by a particular screen.
That makes perfect sense. It's a better user experience. It makes everything feel snappier and easier, quicker to interact with. What are some of the bigger risks and trade-offs that you see if teams try to adopt JSX over the wire ideas or even RSCs too early or without a good understanding of what the benefits really are?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question because it really depends on the framing. Because, for example, with React server components, I think most people encountering it in the wild, they don't encounter it with this perspective of here's a set of problems that it's related to. And it's also not the only way to arrive at this architecture, right? In the article, I also describe a completely separate thread of thought related mostly to native user interfaces, like the way Instagram, Reddit, Airbnb, Uber, and a lot of other builds their native apps is actually with server-side logic that returns UI views. And that is the same exact concept. It's just you arrive from like a different point of view to the same idea. But that is just to say, I think like in practice, the way people encounter, for example, React Server components in the wild today is just because they started using Next.js. Next.js is a popular framework, and it uses this approach. But I think the way it's been described doesn't really explain some of the problems that it solves. And so I think the mental model that a lot of people who tried Next.js have is just, oh, it's some weird optimization. You like some components render on the server for some reason. And then it doesn't really explain, oh, this is one way to think about it. It's just a BFF that's composable, right? It's you're really componentizing your API and not so much like optimizing your components. So I think it helps to understand what problems you want to solve. But in terms of risks, I think with depends on like which approach you pick, right? If you're talking just about the BFF, I think there's one of the risks is that the server part will again deviate from the needs of the client. So like it's very important that if you're committing to this, you should really think of the BFF as almost a part of your front end. It's just a part of the front end that happens to run on the back end. But you need to think about like how to do deployment, how to do versioning, like how do you make sure that the development team has the flexibility to just delete these endpoints, add more of them as the routing logic changes, to change the types. And also like you want the types to be synced, right? Like you want the type seen by the front end for a particular screen to match the type seen on the back end by a particular screen. And so this is where approaches like Remix with loaders, like take a step forward where they ensure that the types are synced because it's just one code base and you just check it with TypeScript. And approaches like React Server components take it yet forward, in my opinion, again, because then they split up that loader into composable pieces that are reusable and they can be composed in the same way that the UI itself is composed. And so it's like each component can have its own front end side and back end side, and those are all composable. And again, the risks there is like misunderstanding the model. I think not having like a good, clear mental picture of what exactly is going on. And also for React Server components, like honestly, the tag itself is still a bit raw. I think it's a bit rough around the edges. The parser bundler released a standalone implementation, which is not tied to a framework. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty and play with it, I think that's a good place to go. And then Next.js App Router kind of offers like a big vision for how you could build big applications with it. But I think it still has a year until it feels like really solid because they're changing some pieces and learning from it. So it's a bit of a work in progress. Obviously, there's many production apps using it, but it's not as seamless and nice to use as it could have been if more time has passed and the edges are evened out.
You also mentioned that the back-end teams might resist moving away from pure REST and the kind of style that they're accustomed to. What have you found persuasive when advocating for screen-specific or component-specific data shaping? Do you have any tips for people who might have a team that is like that?
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's fun. I think like part of the reason why Facebook was able to come up with these constructs is because there is no notion of backend teams at Facebook. That is not how it's organized by products and screens and features, not by these are the people doing this thing and these are the people doing this layer. But of course, like at some point, you do have some competency that is backend specific, right? There are backend people at Facebook, but they work at a layer even above the stack, right? It's like the data layer, the caching layer, like the thing that the product backend team calls into. And so I think one of the ways you can think about this, like advocating for this kind of layer, is it's not really about changing what the backend does. It's more about having an interop layer between the front end and the backend. So it's almost like the front end team is responsible for the UI, and UI should have presence on the server, not in terms of server rendering necessarily. Like a lot of people like, I don't need server rendering. This doesn't have anything to do with server rendering. Your spa could remain a spa, right? It doesn't have anything to do with generate HTML. It's really about how do we prepare the API to be tailored exactly to what the components need. And the answer to this, you just write your API as components. But of course, it doesn't mean killing your existing REST APIs. You could call those, right? So I think it's just about shifting the backend a little bit upwards and then introducing a new thin layer of translation that kind of translate it. And if you have success with this approach, maybe the next step would be, let's write this layer in JavaScript, then we can automatically at least match up the types in a very nice way. And then the next step could be, maybe we try React Server Components because it lets this piece be composable. It lets us avoid duplicating logic and just compose those pieces together.
So if you're shifting the backend up just a little bit, how do you think about caching? Is it at the view model or server component level, or should you cache raw data or pre-computed trees? How should they approach that then?
Yeah, so I think part of it is just whatever the old school backend layer decides, right? If the backend layer implements some kind of caching strategies, like that's cool, that can stay. But I think this approach opens up very interesting possibilities for caching. Next.js is researching, I think, again, like I feel like people will think that I'm plugging Next.js, but like I don't actually care about Next.js. I just think that the ideas they're working on are important. So there's a blog post called Our Journey with Caching by Sebastian Magboge, who's the inventor of hooks, by the way, if you like client-side of React, but also one of the inventors of React Server Components. And he's working on a kind of new caching layer for Next.js with a directive called useCache, which uses the same kind of layered approach as the module system in React Server Components. It's almost like cache is like a separate world. I know I'm hand waving a lot of it, but the key thing about it is it kind of lets you cache at the syntactic level almost. So you can designate certain functions as cacheable. And the thing is that it kind of caches the end result as well. So you can cache the entire view model, or in the React Server Components, that's just the component output, right? It's just the UI itself. You can cache the layout or the page or an individual API call. But the interesting thing is that it allows holes. So in React, there's this common pattern where a component accepts children as a prop. And it doesn't care what you pass as children. It's essentially like a hole punctured in the component. And then the stuff around it is like the stuff where you like update the state or have some data or whatever, but it doesn't care what's inside. So with this approach that Next.js is exploring with useCache, this caching happens at this kind of BFF layer, but the thing being cached is the thing just before substituting the kind of dynamic values into it. So it's actually possible to cache just the layout, and then different pieces of UI have their own separate caching kind of expiration time, which to me is like the holy grail of caching. Is you want to cache the footer forever, then the shell, like maybe it updates like every 10 minutes, and then some parts may be like completely dynamic, and then everything can be composed together. So that is where it's going.
That's fascinating. Something I haven't read up on, so I'll need to check that out for sure. All right. So you emphasized that emitting the JSON and not the HTML is a key choice for React Server Components. So why does this distinction matter so much, and especially for the future of kind of rich applications?
Yeah, so I think this is, so just to make it clear, you can always take JSON and turn it into HTML. But it's hard to take HTML and turn it back into JSON because you have to parse it. HTML parsing rules are quite arcane. Plus, there's no well-defined way to say in HTML, this is the JSON needed for this script. And this kind of like in single-page apps or in server-rendered single-page apps that later continue, they have some dynamic like interactivity. You really want to pass props. Like you want to say, this is a piece of client-side code. It has interactive logic, and it accepts these props that are rich JSON. It's not just HTML attributes. And so if you take HTML and then start extending it in a way that's, you want to express components, you want to pass props to them, you end up with something like JSX maybe. Or if you wanted to serialize it, like JSON would be a natural format. And so the reason this is important is because, again, I think the mental model of old school server rendered apps, PHP and so on, is very simple. You just return some HTML and you compose it, and maybe you have abstractions like your own tags that turn into HTML and so on. So it's a very simple model of just describing what you want to see on the screen. But then this model, you can't really get far with it. I think, sure, there are like PJAX, Turbo, or I forgot what it's called, but all these ways, like HTMX has something for it. I think Morphine, DOM, and so on. There are these approaches that try to deal with refetching. What if you want to navigate to another page, but you don't want to refresh the whole HTML? You don't want to blow away the state. You want it to feel like a snappy client-side transition. Maybe you even want to prefetch it so that it's instant when you click. Or even like refreshing, right? If you just sent a comment, you just want to refresh this part. So how do you kind of replace it in place? And it's possible with HTML, but you hit the limits with kind of interactive bits because you don't want to blow away their state. And so the question is there a way to keep the HTML mental model where if you want to refetch something, you just refetch that HTML, have it be reconciled on the client, have it be kind of merged into your existing structure. If there are new props coming from the server, just have those props be received by components already mounted on the client, already stateful, without blowing anything away. And that is really like what using JSON as the transport. It's not exactly JSON and React Server components, it's more like streaming JSON, so it's a bit better. You can always take that and produce HTML of it, but it's strictly a richer representation, and so it also works for refetches. And that is why this approach is also used in mobile apps. Again, like I mentioned, Uber, Airbnb, Instagram, Reddit, they all use this approach. So they use something that's like React Server components, except instead of client components, they just build native stuff in iOS and Android. And instead of like on the server, it's not React, it's their in-house frameworks that do something similar. But it's the same idea as you can transfer something as JSON and then you can gracefully kind of replace parts of the screen with server rendered stuff without blowing it away as HTML would do.
Yeah. Well, Dan, it's been great talking to you today. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you want people to know about JSX over the wire or React Server components in general?
I think it's just that there's many ways to arrive at the same endpoint. And I think that is partially what makes this technology interesting is you can start with something like GraphQL and then be like, I don't really want to have a different language for describing data, but I want to collocate like the description of like how to get it with my components. And then gradually you might end up with something similar. Or you can start with the REST endpoints and then be like, okay, I need to massage this data for particular screens. So I want to integrate it with my routing. And I want to make it composable. And then again, you can end up with something similar. Or you can start with this idea, oh, I'm just going to send HTML over the wire. On the refetches, I'm also going to send HTML. But I want to keep it stateful. I don't want to replace entire component trees. So maybe I send JSON. And then again, you end up with the same idea. Or you can start with Remix and be like, oh, like these loaders are very nice, but I wish I could split it apart so that it's more like components, more composable. And then you end up with server components. So there's so many ways to arrive at the same idea. I personally find it pretty fascinating, but it can also be overwhelming or like you just don't know from which angle to explain it. Yeah, I don't know, just read the article, see if anything there resonates. I try to present a few different perspectives there. And if you want to play with it, again, like I would suggest the Parcel Bundler released a standalone, not framework specific, it's just the raw stuff. Like I think it's the most raw, officially supported way to consume them from a spa. Like you can literally run a spa and you can run like a parcel, the server bundle that it generates. You don't have to generate HTML from your components. It can be a spa, but it lets you see this concept of, oh, it's this thing that is being passed over the wire, and then I can just embed it in my render tree and it just appears there, but it's actually coming from the server. So that's a way to play with it. And then if you want to see like the big picture of from the person who designed this idea, I think AppRoute still has a way to go. They're changing some things in response to feedback, mostly about caching actually. But I think here's a vision of how you could build entire applications this way that can scale down to something as similar as my blog, for example, or scale up to something like as complex as some of the Facebook screens, hopefully. That is the goal, is that it should scale down and it should also scale up.
Fantastic. Okay, before we wrap things up, we're going to head into our quick round, which is just short, snappy questions. So, for you, what are your must have features for a framework that aims to solve the data and problems you describe, like RSCs do?
Yeah, the key feature is composition. You want to be able to have full stack components that are fully self encapsulated. I have a post about this. It's called Impossible Components, but it's really the idea that you want to be able to refer a thing on the screen by its name, like a blog post, and then you want that or like a post preview, and you want that thing to be able to describe, I'm loading data from this file or like this database or whatever, and I also have some interactive logic, like I'm doing things when you click on me, and then you want to be able to compose these things together as Lego blocks, and they should adapt to a cohesive experience that doesn't do a Trillion fetches from the client, because client is the only thing in terms of which you can think.
If you were designing a new system today from scratch, what principles would you prioritize for bridging, data loading, and UI composition early on?
Same composition. Composition is the most important thing. You want to be able for different people to create the self-isolated abstractions, and then you want to make sure that there is some law of how they compose together, that their behavior when you compose them is meaningful, right? If these two things are doing a fetch, you kind of want to combine those fetches and not have those be like two separate fetches going from the client. So as much as possible, I think you want type safety so that you have a direct connection between, so that you can control click between the server and the client, so there's the connection is syntactic, and then you want to have them be self-isolated, and you want them to be composable.
How do you envision the relationship between server and client evolving over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think there will be I think we're moving towards blending the boundaries a bit more, but blending the boundaries is what's doing it well is tricky, because you actually want the boundaries to remain firm in the technological sense. So you want to make sure that here's a runtime, here's like a file I'm in, it should behave according to the JavaScript logic, right? It shouldn't be magically split into like pieces that I don't understand where the split point is. So I think like you want to have these like firm boundaries between them, but also you want these compositional properties where I can just import this like client bit and pass information from it from the server as if it's just like a function call almost. And so I think we'll see more experiments with what this blending looks like, and the firm boundaries versus fluid boundaries, where it makes sense, which approaches are actually kind of resonating with developers.
That's a perfect lead into the last question. Do you think we'll ever have fully bridge that gap between the back end and front end, or will there always be boundaries? They'll just shift based on what people learn and find works best.
Yeah, I think there are some approaches that are even more, I think, daring in some way than, for example, React Server Components, right? There's this project called, I think, Electric Closure, which also blends the server and the client, but more automatically from what I presume. I'm not very good at reading Lisp syntax and understanding fully what's going on. So I may not be the best person to advocate for it. But I think there is a very real gap between the server and the client, right? It's a gap in time and space, right? It's a gap in time because they execute like at different times. One of them is potentially cacheable. The other one potentially runs a lot more times in response to state updates and so on. So it's like these are different pieces of code, and there's a space gap where it just takes time to move these electrons along the wire and actually, or photons, I don't know how it's implemented under the hood, but let's say the vibrations of the quantum field. But they're in separate pieces, and you can't treat them as code that runs on the same computer, right? Like you need to incorporate that gap into your programming model as the first-class citizen. And so I think that is where it's going. I think React Server Components is an important innovation there, and I think it's an innovation that has been overlooked, honestly. And I think people will catch up eventually to what it actually does, which is it puts the network gap into your module system as a first-class primitive. I have a post about this. It's called "What Does Use Client Do?" Check it out if you want to find out how that's done. But I think we'll see more of this kind of incorporating the network as a first-class citizen into the syntax of our programming languages and programming paradigms. And I'm pretty excited to see different variations on this idea.
If people want to get in touch with you to talk more about RSCs or anything else, where are the best places to find you online?
Bluesky is pretty good. I'm bsky.app/profile/denebra.move. That's my domain. I'm not on Twitter. I don't think I want to get back on Twitter. It's just, I don't know. I'm just not vibing with it right now. I'm also on YouTube now. So I made the first video about one of my posts. I think if you search Dan Abramov, you'll probably find me on YouTube. And that I also have an email, but I barely read it. Yeah, but you can try. Yeah.
Excellent. We'll be sure to link all of those in the show notes. And Dan, thank you again for joining us. It's been great having you on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for inviting. I really appreciate it.